I could feel the warning form behind my teeth like blood rising in the back of the throat. Hot, metallic, undeniable, and I learned how easy it was to swallow. There are moments when your mind moves faster than your body, when you see the shape of a mistake, when the air in a room shifts by a fraction, and your instincts, those old, animal instincts that never earned a medal, start scraping at the inside of your ribs. It wasn't bravery, notice. It was fear. Fear has a way of sharpening the smallest details until they cut. A pause that lasts one heartbeat too long. A word chosen too carefully. The way a hand hesitates over a map, a document, a radio dial. Like the person touching it knows that the next motion will be permanent. I remember the weight of that knowledge more than anything that followed. Not the noise, not the movement, not the aftermath that other people would talk about later in neat sentences. As if disaster can be contained by grammar. I remember the seconds before, when nothing had happened yet, and it still felt too late. My thoughts kept circling the same simple question, over and over, like a fly trapped between glass and light. Do you say it? Do you put your voice into the room and change the temperature? Or do you keep it inside and let it rot quietly, where no one can blame you for the smell? What I understood, without being able to prove it, was that something was wrong in a way that didn't announce itself. It wasn't a dramatic wrongness, not a visible crack in a wall, not a scream, not a collapse. It was the kind of wrongness that hides in confidence, the kind that wears certainty like a uniform and expects everyone else to salute. I had nothing solid, nothing anyone would call evidence, only a string of small impressions that lined up too neatly to be coincidence. A pattern that my mind traced in the dark, the way you trace a familiar face with your fingertips when the lights are out. And because I couldn't name it with authority, I started to doubt it. That is what doubt does best. It doesn't erase what you know. It only makes you feel ashamed for knowing it. I tried to argue with myself because arguing with yourself is safer than arguing with anyone who can ruin you with a signature. Maybe you're tired. Maybe you misheard. Maybe it isn't your place. Maybe it's not as bad as you think. Maybe you're imagining things because fear needs something to chew. But every time I pushed the thought away, it returned heavier. It returned with the same pressure behind the eyes, the same tightening in the throat. My body reacting to a truth my mouth refused to carry. I listened to voices around me, steady, assured, routine, and I felt my own silence becoming an object, something with weight, something I could almost hold in my hand. It wasn't that I wanted to be right. It was that I wanted to be wrong, because being wrong would mean nothing would happen. Being wrong would mean the world would continue in its brutal, ordinary way, and my fear would be nothing more than an embarrassing twitch. But I could not make myself believe that. The worst part wasn't the fear of consequences later. It was the fear of consequences immediately. The fear of the glance that would slide toward me if I spoke. The pause that would follow my word. The moment the room would decide what I was. A nuisance. A coward pretending to be wise. A voice out of place. A problem to be managed. It's strange how quickly your mind can build a cage out of imagined reactions. How you can become prisoner to people who haven't even looked at you yet. I pictured my warning landing wrong. I pictured it being repeated with a different tone, turned into something small and laughable. I pictured my own face flushing, my voice thinning, my certainty evaporating under the clean pressure of someone else's confidence. And then I pictured something worse, the possibility that they would listen, that they would stop, that they would ask me to explain, that they would turn their attention to me, and I would have to hold the weight of it with nothing but instinct and dread. Because if I spoke, and they listened, and I was wrong, I would not just be embarrassed. I would be responsible for delaying something that everyone else believed had to happen. And in places like that, responsibility is a kind of target. So I stayed still. I trained my face into something neutral. I let my eyes move at the right moments. I breathed when everyone else breathed. I watched my own words shrink inside me until they became only a feeling, a pressure, a pulse, a faint, desperate knocking from the inside of my chest, like someone locked in a room that was slowly filling with smoke. I told myself that silence was not the same as agreement. I told myself that silence could be temporary, that there would be another moment, a better moment, a clearer moment. A moment when the warning would sound less like fear and more like certainty. But time does not make room. Time only moves. And while it moved, I felt the decision making itself, not in some dramatic gesture, not in a spoken vow, but in the smallest surrender a person can make, in the way the tongue rests instead of rising. In the way the breath is released instead of used, in the way a thought becomes a secret. By the time I realized the words were gone, I had already chosen not to say them, and I let that choice stand. The first time I understood how power works, it wasn't in a speech or a punishment. It was in the way a room learned what not to ask. It started as routine, not the kind people like to imagine when they think about wartime. The shouting, the charging, the cinematic moments where everyone's face is clean enough to be remembered. It was quieter than repetitive, administrative. A world built out of paper, timed messages, and voices that sounded calm precisely because they had trained themselves never to sound afraid. Days were measured in intervals. Waiting for a signal, waiting for a confirmation, waiting for the next decision to arrive from somewhere above, carried down like weather. You didn't argue with it. You adjusted your posture and prepared for it. Everything important came from higher up, and everything dangerous flowed downward. There were lines you didn't cross, not because anyone had drawn them in, but because you could feel the heat behind them. The wrong question could turn a face towards you in a way that made your stomach drop. The wrong suggestion could make you suddenly visible. And visibility in that system was never a gift. It was exposure. I wasn't the one who gave orders. I didn't have the kind of authority that made men rearrange themselves around a decision. I was close enough to hear things early, close enough to understand the shape of what was coming, but not close enough to stop it. That middle place, near, but not near enough, is where fear grows best. It wasn't a single person I was afraid of. That would have been easier. If fear has a face, you can imagine confronting it. You can imagine outlasting it. But this wasn't a face. It was structure. A chain that didn't need to rattle to be felt. There were always reminders of, not spoken usually, just present. A chair that no one sat in unless invited. A silence that formed when certain names were mentioned. A way people stood when a certain voice came over a line. Backs straighter, hands still, eyes focused on something that wasn't the speaker, as if looking directly at authority might invite punishment. Even laughter was careful. It happened, but it never lingered. It had edges. It knew when to stop. When you live inside that kind of hierarchy long enough, you stop noticing it as control. It becomes air. It becomes normal, and you start to treat your own thoughts like contraband, something you can possess, but never display. I watched men learn that lesson without anyone teaching it directly. Someone would make a suggestion that sounded harmless, practically, and the room would respond with a kind of stillness. Not anger, not debate, just a sudden disciplined quiet, as if the suggestion had contaminated Then someone else, someone who understood the rules, would redirect. He'd restate the plan the way it had already been stated. He'd use the approved language. He'd smooth the moment out like a wrinkle in cloth, and the man who had spoken would sit back, mouth closed, eyes lowered slightly, as if he had stepped too close to a ledge. No reprimand was needed. The system corrected itself. I began to understand that this was how obedience maintained its purity. Not through constant punishment, but through the subtle social signals that made you punish yourself before anyone else had to. I also learned something worse. The people around me were not fools. They noticed things. They felt tension. They could smell trouble. But they had learned to interpret discomfort as personal weakness, not as a warning. If something felt wrong, the assumption wasn't that the plan was flawed. The assumption was that you were not disciplined enough to accept it. That is how hierarchy keeps moving even when it's moving toward a wall. There were briefings that felt less like information and more like ritual, words repeated in the same order, phrases that carried authority simply because they had been used before. I heard the same certainty spoken with different voices, and I started to understand that certainty could be inherited like a uniform. People didn't ask, "Is this correct?" They asked, "Is this confirmed?" Confirmation mattered more than truth, because confirmation came with protection. If you followed confirmed instructions, you were safe, at least in the narrow sense that mattered inside a chain of command. You might still die, but you wouldn't be blamed, and blame was its own kind of death. In that environment, responsibility was a strange thing. It was spoken of like honor, but treated like contagion. Everyone wanted to appear responsible, but no one wanted to be the person whose fingerprints were found on a decision when it went wrong. So you learned to keep your hands clean. You learned to be useful without being loud. You learned to pass concerns upward in the softest possible way, wrapped in neutrality, disguised as curiosity, phrased like a request for clarification rather than a warning. Even then, you did it only if you had to, because there was always the risk that your concern would be heard as doubt. And doubt, in that system, was not considered intelligence. It was considered disloyalty. I watched the hierarchy absorb people. A man could arrive with confidence and sharp eyes, asking questions like, he still believed questions mattered. Within weeks, he would speak less. Within months, he would learn the same calm tone everyone. He would begin to nod before he fully understood, not because he was careless, but because he was adapting. Adaptation looked like professionalism. It looked like maturity. It looked like knowing your place. And every time someone adapted, the system grew stronger. Not because it became smarter, but because it became quieter. I started to notice my own changes. How I waited before speaking, even when asked directly. How I rehearsed sentences in my head, trimming them down, removing anything that sounded like opinion. How I listened more than I talked, and called it discipline. How I felt relief when I stayed invisible. The setting itself encouraged it. The spaces were functional, not human. Light that was too harsh or too weak. Walls that held sound in uncomfortable ways. The constant presence of equipment. Radios, papers, maps, clocks. Objects that never slept. Objects that made you feel as if your own fatigue was a failure of character. There were always clocks. Always measurements. Always the sense that time was being spent, and that spending it incorrectly was a kind of betrayal. And above all of it, there was the unspoken knowledge that there were consequences for making things harder. If you slowed a process, you became an obstacle. If you complicated a decision, you became a problem. If you raised a warning without certainty, you became noise. Noise was punished not because it was wrong, but because it disrupted rhythm. The machine preferred rhythm. So when I began to feel that pressure again, the same pressure from block 1, the same metallic taste of words trying to rise, I understood immediately why it felt dangerous. It wasn't only fear of being wrong, it was fear of being the kind of person who stops the machine. Because the machine would not stop gently. It would turn its weight toward you, and you would feel every inch of that hierarchy pressing down, asking the same silent question in 100 different "Who are you to say any?" And the worst part was that I had no good answer. I knew the decision-makers were not monsters. They weren't cartoon villains. They were men shaped by the same structure, trained to believe that hesitation was weakness, that momentum was competence, that certainty was leadership. I had watched them speak in that calm tone, watched them treat complexity like an enemy. I had watched them reduce human uncertainty into clean directives. And I understood, in a way that made me sick, that this was not done out of cruelty. It was done out of necessity, or what they called necessity. Because war doesn't reward nuance. It punishes it. It makes you choose quickly, even when choosing quickly is how you walk into ruin. The structure existed to help them choose without flinching, which meant that anyone who flinched in front of them, anyone who introduced doubt, became something the structure needed to remove. Not violently, necessarily, just efficiently. A reassignment, a cold note in a file. A loss of trust so subtle you wouldn't be able to point to the moment it happened, only to the moment you realized you no longer belonged. And because I understood all of that, I began to do what everyone else did. I began to practice silence before I was asked to. I began to carry my thoughts like a hidden weight, shifting it from one hand to another in the dark, pretending it wasn't there. And each day the pressure grew, not because the danger became obvious, but because the system kept moving with the same calm certainty, as if doubt itself had no place to stand. So when the next set of instructions arrived, when the room adjusted its posture and the rhythm resumed, I already knew what I was going to do. I was going to listen. I was going to nod at the right moments. I was going to keep my warning inside, where it couldn't interrupt anything. And I was going to call that obedience. Once you accept silence as a skill, it begins to refine itself. At first, the restraint feels active. You feel yourself holding something back, like a muscle clenched too long. There is effort in it. Awareness. You are conscious of every moment when you could speak and choose not to. But over time, the silence becomes internal. Automatic. You stop thinking of it as a choice and start treating it as instinct. That is when it becomes dangerous. I would hear fragments of information drift past me, partial confirmations, adjusted timelines, assumptions stated with confidence, and something in my chest would tighten, not sharply, not enough to demand attention, just enough to register as unease. I told myself unease was normal. War is built on unease. If you waited for comfort, nothing would ever move. So I learned to reinterpret the sensation. I renamed it. I told myself it was stress. I told myself it was fatigue. I told myself it was the natural anxiety of being close to decisions I wasn't meant to shape. Renaming a fear doesn't remove it. It just makes it easier to carry. There were moments, small, fleeting ones, when the words almost escaped. When a phrase formed fully, polished itself, waited on the edge of my tongue. Sometimes it happened when someone asked a question that brushed against the same fault line I'd been circling in my own mind. Sometimes it happened when a plan was restated one time too many, as if repetition alone could harden it into truth. In those moments, my body would betray me before my voice did. A breath held too long, a shift in posture, fingers pressing together, then releasing. I would imagine speaking as a physical act, the sound leaving my mouth, crossing the space between me and the others, the way it would interrupt the rhythm of the room. I imagined the pause that would follow. Because there is always a pause after doubt enters a disciplined space. In that pause, everyone recalculates. They look not at the concern, but at the person who raised it. I knew how that look felt. I had seen it land on others. Not hostile, not openly dismissive. Evaluative, measuring, weighing the cost of allowing this voice to continue. I told myself I wasn't afraid of punishment. That wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Punishment was obvious. Punishment was crude. You could prepare for punishment. What I feared was something quieter. I feared being redefined. I feared that once I spoke, I would no longer be seen as reliable, but as cautious. Once seen as cautious, I would be seen as hesitant. Once seen as hesitant, I would be seen as weak. And weakness, in that environment, was not forgiven. It was managed. I pictured my concern being acknowledged with a nod and then folded into silence. Not debated, not disproven. Simply absorbed and neutralized. Worse, I pictured it being accepted. I pictured someone higher up asking me to explain further. I pictured my words being written down, paraphrased, stripped of the instinct that had given them urgency. Because instincts don't translate well into reports. And if my warning became part of the process, then whatever followed, whatever delay, whatever adjustment, would be connected to me. Responsibility would shift. And responsibility, I had learned, was a burden passed downward whenever possible. I began to construct arguments against myself. Not emotional ones, practical. I told myself I lacked the full picture. I told myself there were factors I wasn't privy to, layers of planning above my view that justified what I saw as a mistake. I told myself that the people making these decisions had more experience, more information, more authority. Authority became my strongest argument against my own conscience. Who was I to see what they did not? Who was I to challenge a structure that had been tested by years of conflict? Who was I to assume that my discomfort meant danger, rather than inexperience? Each question felt reasonable, responsible, and yet, the doubt remained. It didn't grow louder, it grew steadier. It began to appear at inconvenient times, while I was doing routine tasks, while listening to unrelated discussions, while watching the ordinary movements of people who believed things were under control. I would catch myself watching faces instead of listening to words, searching for signs I wasn't alone in my unease. Sometimes I thought I saw them, a flicker of hesitation in someone's eyes, a pause before agreement, a sentence that ended just short of objection. But no one crossed the line. No one said the thing that needed to be said. And because no one else spoke, I began to doubt myself more deeply. There is a peculiar loneliness in being the only one who hasn't convinced himself yet. Silence from others does not reassure you. It accuses you. It suggests that the problem is not the plan, but you. I imagined the future where I stayed quiet. It was an easy future to picture. I had seen versions of it play out countless times. The plan would proceed. The system would absorb minor complications. People would adjust, adapt, improvise. If things went well, no one would ever know there had been another path. If things went badly, the failure would be diffuse, spread across timelines, conditions, unforeseeable variables, and I would be safe inside that. I would be one of many who followed instructions, one of many who could honestly say they did not decide anything. That imagined safety was seductive. Then I imagined the other future, the one where I spoke. In that future, the moment was clear and singular. My voice marked time. There was a before and an after. Even if nothing changed, even if the decision stood, I would be linked to the disruption. My words would exist in memory. Someone would remember that I had hesitated. And in environments built on confidence, remembered hesitation is a stain. I imagined how people would look at me afterward, slightly differently, slightly less openly. I imagined how conversations would adjust around my presence. I imagined the subtle exclusion, the way important information might arrive a little later, or not at all, not as punishment, as precaution. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself I was dramatizing, but the images came from experience, not imagination. I had seen how systems protect themselves. I had seen how dissent is not crushed, but isolated, until it no longer matters. And so I hovered in that internal space, between action and restraint, while time continued to move. The moments when speaking would have been simplest passed quickly. They were replaced by moments when speaking would require interruption. Interruption requires confidence. Confidence was something I no longer trusted myself to have. Each second I waited made the next second heavier. The longer I stayed silent, the more out of place my voice would sound. Eventually, the warning began to feel less like a responsibility and more like an intrusion. Who was I to bring uncertainty into a process already underway? Who was I to complicate things when others had accepted them? This was the final rationalization, the one that nearly convinced me completely. That silence was not cowardice. That silence was restraint. That silence was discipline. That silence was loyalty. And in believing that, I felt the last resistance soften. The words were still there, but they no longer pressed as hard. They settled into me, like something resigned to being carried rather than released. I began to move through my duties with a strange calm, a calm built not on confidence, but on surrender. The danger I sensed did not disappear, but I began to treat it as inevitable rather than preventable. That shift, subtle, almost invisible, was the most important decision I made. Because once you stop believing something can be changed, silence no longer feels like a choice. It feels like the only reasonable response. And that is how I stood, on the edge of speaking, while the moment for it quietly narrowed, not gone yet, but closing. The moment did not announce itself. There was no dramatic pause, no raised voices, no sense that history was drawing a line in front of us. It arrived the way most irreversible things do, quietly, wrapped in routine, disguised as another step in a process that had already convinced itself it was correct. We were standing where we always stood, sitting where we always sat. The same controlled posture, the same neutral expressions, the same careful attention to words that had been chosen long before they reached us. The decision moved through the room without resistance, not rushed, not questioned, confirmed. I remember the exact instant my body understood before my mind finished catching up, a tightening in the chest that felt less like fear and more like recognition, like seeing a door close slowly and realizing you are on the wrong side of it. This was it, not the outcome, not the consequence. This was the moment where the last opening still existed. Someone spoke, steady, precise, confident. The words were familiar. They followed the logic that had been building for days, a logic that made sense if you accepted its first assumption. That assumption was wrong. I knew it in the same way you know when ice will not hold your weight. Not because you've tested it, but because something in you recognizes the sound it makes beneath your feet. My warning rose again, sharper this time, not as a vague unease, but as a complete thought, clear enough to be spoken, clear enough to interrupt. All it required was breath. I felt my mouth part slightly, just enough. A reflex, almost. Muscle memory from a life where speaking when something was wrong had once been encouraged. The room felt smaller in that fraction of a second, as if sound itself were waiting to see what shape it would take. And in that suspended space, everything I feared condensed into a single pressure. I saw the eyes that would turn toward me. I saw the subtle recalibration of I saw myself becoming the interruption, not the savior, not the voice of reason, the disruption. I felt heat rise in my face, not from shame, but from exposure, the kind that comes when you realize you are about to make yourself visible in a place designed to erase individuals. My heartbeat became loud enough that I wondered if anyone else could hear it. I told myself to speak quickly, that speed would make it easier, that if I said it plainly without emotion, it might land as information rather than doubt. But speed requires commitment, and commitment was exactly what I did not have. The words hesitated in my teeth. They felt heavier than before, as if gravity itself had shifted inside me. What had once been a warning now felt like an accusation, one that would need defending. Someone else nodded in agreement with the decision being spoken. That nod mattered more than it should have. It sealed something. I felt my chance narrowing, not dramatically, but mechanically, like a window being closed not because of danger, but because the temperature had been set. The decision was no longer forming, it was formed. All that remained was acknowledgement. I could still speak, technically, but now I would be contradicting something complete. The difference between questioning and opposing is thin, but everyone in that room knew it. I swallowed. The physical act was involuntary, but its meaning was not. The warning went down with it. I felt it move through me, hot, bitter, unmistakable, and settle somewhere lower, where it could no longer reach my voice. I kept my eyes forward. I adjusted my posture by a fraction, aligning myself with the stillness of the others. Someone asked if there were any objection. The question was procedural, a formality. The room did not change, neither did I. The silence that followed was brief, but decisive, not empty, final. I felt a strange calm arrive once the moment passed. Not relief, something flatter. The calm of having chosen the easier path. The calm of no longer being at risk of becoming the problem. I told myself it wasn't my responsibility. I told myself the decision had already been made before I entered the room. I told myself that speaking now would have changed nothing. Each justification arrived smoothly, as if rehearsed. But underneath them was a simpler truth I did not allow myself to say. I had been afraid. Afraid of consequences I could imagine. Afraid of attention I did not want. Afraid of standing alone in a room built to reward alignment. The decision moved forward, carried by signatures, confirmations, and practiced certainty. The room relaxed slightly, as if tension had been released. People shifted, pens moved, the rhythm resumed, and I remained exactly where I was. Not because I believed in what had been decided, but because I had chosen silence when my voice was still possible. That was the moment. No sound marked it, no one noticed. But something irreversible had taken place. Not in the plan. The consequences did not arrive all at once. They rarely do. At first, everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to. The system moved forward with its familiar rhythm. Messages were sent, responses returned, timelines adjusted by small, reasonable, nothing dramatic enough to demand immediate recognition. If I had been looking for proof that my silence had been justified, I could have found it in hours. The absence of immediate disaster is powerful. It allows doubt to masquerade as wisdom. I told myself that the unease would pass, that whatever flaw I had sensed had already been accounted for somewhere beyond my view, that my fear had been premature. But the feeling did not leave. It changed shape. It settled into something colder, heavier, less urgent, more persistent. The first sign was subtle, a deviation small enough to be dismissed if you wanted to dismiss it. A report that arrived later than expected. A confirmation that carried more qualifiers than usual. A voice over a line that sounded slightly less certain than it had before. No one said anything. No one needed to. The structure absorbed it the way it absorbed everything, by smoothing the surface and pushing forward. I watched the adjustments accumulate, not enough to stop anything, just enough to strain it. Each new piece of information felt like pressure added to a structure already set. There was no opportunity to rethink, only to reinforce. The response to uncertainty was not pause, but acceleration. I felt something inside me tighten with each update. Not panic, recognition. The thing I had tried not to see was becoming visible, not as a single failure, but as a pattern. A sequence of small compensations masking a growing instability. And still, there was no moment where speaking would have felt appropriate. That is the cruelty of delayed consequences. By the time the danger becomes clear, the window for warning has already closed. I began to hear the language shift, not openly, not dramatically, but the words people used started to change. Confidence gave way to efficiency. Efficiency gave way to necessity. Necessity gave way to inevitability. I recognized that progression. I had heard it before. It is how people talk when they sense something slipping out of control but refuse to name it. The environment changed with it. The air felt heavier. Conversations shortened. Laughter disappeared entirely. Not because it was forbidden, but because no one had the excess energy for it. People stopped asking broad questions and started asking narrow ones. How long? How much? How soon? Questions that assume continuation, not reconsideration. That was when the first real confirmation arrived. Not as spectacle, not as collapse, but as quiet acknowledgement. A message that didn't need interpretation. A fact that aligned too closely with what I had feared. I read it once. Then again. I felt no surprise, only a dull, sinking weight. This was what I had seen coming. Not precisely, not in detail, but in shape, in direction, in consequence. I felt my silence shift inside me. What had once felt like restraint now felt like complicity. Not active, not chosen with intent, but real nonetheless. From that point on, the unfolding was relentless. Each development carried the echo of the same mistake, repeated under different circumstances. Each attempt to correct course came too late, applied to symptoms rather than cause. I watched people work harder as the situation worsened. Longer hours, shorter tempers, less sleep. Effort increased in proportion to failure, as if exhaustion itself could compensate for a flawed foundation. I saw the moment when hope changed tone. Hope, earlier, had sounded like confidence. Now it sounded like pleading. People stopped saying will and started saying should. A small shift, a devastating. There were moments when I almost spoke then, not to warn, but to confess, to say that I had known something was wrong before it happened. But confession would not have undone anything. It would only have redistributed blame, and I was not brave enough to do that either. The realization that hurt most was not that the outcome was bad, it was that it was familiar. I had seen variations of it before, different contexts, different names, same structure, same momentum. The system did not break. It did exactly what it was designed to do. It continued. Even as the cost became undeniable, the response remained procedural. Damage was assessed. Adjustments were made. New directives issued to compensate for old ones. No one stood up and said this should not have happened. That kind of statement implies authorship, and authorship was carefully. The human cost, what there was of it, was spoken of obliquely, reduced to numbers, timelines, conditions. abstracted just enough to make it manageable. I listened to those discussions with a strange detachment. Part of me wanted to scream that it did not have to be this way. Another part, the part that had learned silence well, understood that screaming now would be obscene, because the time for warning had passed. Now there was only accounting. I began to replay the moment in my head. Not obsessively, not emotionally, methodically. I examined every detail of that silence. The exact posture I held, the way my breath caught, the second when my chance slipped away. I did not imagine alternate futures where everything was saved. That would have been dishonest. I imagined something smaller, a pause, a delay, a reconsideration, enough friction to force awareness, enough resistance to slow the machine, and that was when the weight became unbearable. Not because I believed I could have prevented everything, but because I knew I could have tried. The guilt did not arrive as self-loathing. It arrived as clarity, clear, sharp, merciless. I understood then that silence does not disappear once the moment passes. It follows you. It attaches itself to outcomes, to conversations, to reports written after the fact. Every time someone expressed surprise at how things had unfolded, I felt it tighten. Every time someone said, "No one could have known," I felt it twist. I had known, not fully, not confidently, but enough. And that knowledge, unspoken, became my burden. I carried it through the rest of the unfolding, through the final confirmations, through the quiet acknowledgement that what had happened could not be undone. I carried it as the system reset itself, preparing for the next decision, the next momentum, the next inevitability. No one asked me what I had thought beforehand. I did not offer it, and in that continued silence, I understood something that stayed with me long after the consequences stopped unfolding. Silence does not end when the damage is done. It becomes permanent. It settles into you, shaping the way you watch, the way you listen, the way you remember. The outcome confirmed my fear, but the deeper cost was something else entirely. It was the knowledge that when the moment demanded courage, I had chosen preservation instead. And nothing that followed, no explanation, no context, no shared responsibility, could change that. Time did not soften it. That was the first thing I learned. I had believed, quietly, without ever admitting it, that distance would dull the edge, that once events moved far enough into the past, memory would rearrange itself into something bearable. That silence, once endured, would eventually be absorbed by other noises. It didn't happen that way. What faded were the details that didn't matter. Faces blurred, voices lost their exact pitch, sequences compressed. But the moment of silence, the precise instant when I chose not to speak, remained intact, preserved with an accuracy nothing else achieved. It returns without warning, not as a dramatic recollection, not as a nightmare, as a simple intrusion. I'll be doing something ordinary, reading, waiting, listening to someone explain a problem they believe has no clear cause, and suddenly, I'm back in that room, feeling the same pressure in my chest, the same suspended breath, the same narrowing of possibility. I don't relive what happened afterward. I relive what didn't happen. That is the punishment silence leaves behind. It does not replay the outcome. It replays the decision. Over time, I stopped trying to justify myself. Justifications require an audience, even if that audience is only your own conscience pretending to be reasonable. I stopped telling myself I lacked authority. I stopped telling myself the system would not have listened. I stopped telling myself the warning was too vague, too incomplete, too uncertain. Those explanations lost their power once I understood something simpler. I had not stayed silent because I was unsure. I had stayed silent because I was afraid. Afraid of exposure. Afraid of disruption. Afraid of being the one whose voice altered the shape of the... That fear does not disappear just because the moment has passed. It lingers, reshaped into something colder, more permanent. It becomes knowledge about yourself. I learned that when pressure and hierarchy align, I am capable of convincing myself that restraint is virtue, that obedience is maturity, that silence is professionalism. I learned how easily I can reinterpret cowardice as discipline. That understanding did not come with shame at first. It came with resignation, a quiet acceptance that this is who I was in that moment, and that nothing I do afterward can rewrite it. People sometimes talk about guilt as if it is loud, as if it demands confession or punishment. This guilt does neither. It waits. It sits behind conversations where responsibility is distributed so thinly no one can be held accountable. It sits behind phrases like unavoidable and unforeseeable, and no one could have known. Each time I hear those words, something inside me tightens, not because they are false in general, but because they were false once. Once, someone did know, and that someone said nothing. I am careful now, not in the way people mean when they say that, not wiser, not braver. Careful in the sense that I measure my own silences more closely. I notice when my throat tightens. I notice when a thought lingers too long without being spoken. And sometimes, often, I still choose quiet. That is the part no one wants to hear. Guilt does not automatically transform you. Memory does not guarantee courage. Knowing what you failed to do once does not mean you will succeed the next time. It only means you will recognize the moment, and recognition, I have learned, is not the same as action. The silence I chose that day did not end when the consequences did. It followed me into every room where decisions were made, into every space shaped by authority and momentum. It taught me how thin the line is between doubt and disappearance, between warning and obedience, between what you know and what you allow to happen. I do not frame myself as a victim of circumstance. I was present. I understood enough. I hesitated, and when hesitation mattered, I let it harden into silence. That is the memory that remains. Not the damage, not the aftermath, not the explanations offered later. Just the knowledge that there was a moment when the future was still uncertain, when a single voice might have slowed it, redirected it, changed its weight, and I was there, and I said nothing. That doubt changed nothing, but it changed me, in a way that never resolved, in a way that never needed to be spoken aloud to be permanent.